Welcome to today's Energy Central webcast entitled Developing a Sustainable Approach to Grid Modernization Investment Planning. A few housekeeping notes we'd like to mention. We acknowledge that given the higher demands on internet connections where many are working from home, technical issues may be more pronounced. If for any reason we find the need to restart the event, we invite you to click your same link to rejoin. If you cannot get adequate sound from your computer speakers, you may dial into the audio portion using the telephone number listed in the right-hand panel of your interface under the audio section. We invite you to submit your questions at any time using the interface on your screen. Now I'd like to turn the floor over to Russ Stothers with Copperleaf to kick things off. Russ, welcome to the event. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. So good morning, good afternoon to everyone. I'd like to welcome you to our presentation on developing a sustainable approach to grid modernization investment planning. My name is Russ Stothers, and I'm a product manager at Copperleaf Technologies. I have 25 years of business experience in high technology, product development and service companies with specific expertise in the renewable energy sector. I'm really excited to be here today and to be joined by my two panelists, both of which have deep experiences around grid modernization. I'd now like to let each of them introduce themselves. So I'll pass it over to Gene. Can you please introduce yourself?
Okay, thank you, Russ. Gene Shlatz. I'm a director at Guidehouse in the energy sustainability and infrastructure practice. I've spent over 35 years in the industry, predominantly electric utility related engagements. Last 22 years at Guidehouse, I've been involved with energy related engagements throughout North America, US and Canada, as well as internationally in South America, the United Kingdom, as well as the Middle East. Previously, I was the Director of Engineering and Operations for Green Mountain Power, where I was responsible for pretty much all aspects of engineering, planning, and operations. I've testified extensively before state and federal regulators, FERC, state commissions, as well as the US House of Representatives on electric reliability, and just a fairly broad background and pretty much all aspects of power system generation and delivery. And with that, I'll turn it over to Adam.
Hey, thanks, Gene. Adam Brown here from the AES Corporation. I lead our utilities asset management area. Been with the company since 2008. Background in generation, reliability engineering, asset management, investment planning. At AES, asset management for us, what I lead is our traditional T&D, transmission and distribution planning, our reliability engineering, investment planning, and standards for the U.S. utilities businesses. So been involved with Copperleaf really since about 2016. Our implementation started 2018. So looking forward to talking to you guys.
Great. Thank you both. So the plan for today will be as follows. I'll first begin by setting some of the industry context around grid modernization. What are some of those external factors that are driving the strong move in this direction? I'll then be passing it over to Gene and Adam, who will then describe why utilities are facing significant obstacles related to grid modernization, especially as new challenges continue to emerge. They'll discuss why common approaches to investment planning are no longer viable and why utilities must evolve their planning processes if they want to be successful. Gene and Adam will then, after laying that foundation, they'll then move to provide you with their thoughts on a preferred and sustainable approach to these challenges. We want to make this session as interactive as possible, given it is a webinar. So for everyone watching, please write down your questions, comments, and feedbacks and put those into the chat. We've reserved the last portion of the talk today to address your questions so we can really have a good open dialogue around that. So grid modernization is going to have a profound impact on the nature and regulation of North American utilities. It will represent a major change to the way energy is managed, distributed, and used today and in the future. Before we jump into our discussions, I just want to highlight this quote. I won't read it out to you, as I'm sure you're already way ahead of me, but I really wanted to highlight the part about, for the first time, we will not use fire to get the most out of our energy. So what I really like to highlight here is that it talks about challenges, but really more importantly, it's the opportunity ahead of ourselves. It's clear that the transformation to a clean energy future is accelerating and the pace will continue to increase. One of the big themes that we have seen as we work with our clients on this issue is a shift in thinking, really about grid modernization, not so much being a problem, but really is a huge opportunity, both from a business as well as a societal perspective. Historically, utilities have been focused on delivering safe, reliable, and affordable energy to their customers. This mandate has driven them to develop capital plans that are focused on asset sustainment, as well as growth opportunities that were in alignment with these primary business objectives. As we are well aware, the mandate we're seeing today is evolving and becoming increasingly complex and multifaceted. We are seeing new drivers around clean, resilient, and a flexible energy supply. We're expecting massive disruption across the entire energy value chain that will affect a broad set of stakeholders. The clean energy transition and the drive towards decarbonization, including the net zero targets that many of you have for 2050, is requiring a shift towards an increasingly clean, intelligent, mobile, and distributed energy ecosystem. In addition to these requirements, there's also a need to ensure the resulting grid is more resilient and flexible to accommodate these ever-changing environmental conditions. A great example of the flexibility is the supporting the transition from what we now know, the one-way traditional power system to a bidirectional and highly digitized and dynamic energy system. Before we go far too into this discussion, we thought it would be useful to spend a bit of time clarifying the term grid modernization so we're all on the same page and we're all talking about the same, focus on the same issues. So with that, I would like to pass it over first to Gene and then to Adam to provide their perspective on what this means to their businesses.
Okay,
So Gene,
thank you, Russ. Grid modernization is a fairly broad term and certainly means different things to different folks within various organizations. So when we think it from a resource planning perspective, the focus for grid modernization is perhaps increased reliance on distributed energy resources to meet growing demand. When we think it from the power delivery function, perhaps replacing obsolete or deteriorated assets. Operations, that might mean bringing deteriorated assets to reliable condition, typically through replacement. Those on the technology front often think of grid modernization as an opportunity to introduce automation, operational enabling technologies to improve efficiency, reliability, to enable distributed generation integration, and to better manage the grid for a more reliable and efficient basis. When we think it from a regulatory standpoint, very often we think in terms of the grid modernization in terms of complying with state or federal initiatives or mandates, relying on technology to harden the grid, meet the decarbonization goals that Russ referred to earlier, as well as renewable energy targets, introducing non-wild alternatives as an option. So grid modernization certainly means different things to different folks. So, with that, Adam, I would raise on your end, how does AES, for example, view grid modernization, and perhaps what are some of the initiatives that AES is pursuing?
Yeah, so at AES, number one, I think the definition of grid modernization, I think you're correct in saying that it means different things for different organizations. It means different things for similar organizations with multiple regulatory structures, right? It's very complicated. For us, in addition to the points you have here, one of the key things is that grid modernization we see as a key enabler for us to better serve our customer, right? And so that's our primary focus is, building a cleaner energy future together. And so focusing on customers, focusing on our ability to provide quickly and in an agile fashion, different options for our customers. And the same thing, greater reliance on DERs. We've been going down this path for a long, long time. And for us, grid modernization is the opportunity to better live out our core mission, period, right? So in Ohio, we've got Smart Grid, and in AES Indiana, we have what we call our TDISC program, which are both, grid modernization, smart grid programs. sweeping, huge investments.
Okay. As a follow-up to that, say as a multi-state company, actually international, do you see these initiatives varying by jurisdiction, for example?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the means of recovery vary depending on the specific regulatory framework. And I think that with that comes a different focus on, what specifically we're going to invest in. But the core foundational view that the grid must be modernized, that we must be more flexible and more agile, I think that is universal.
Thank you for that. Okay, Russ, I think we can move on to the next slide.
What?
Okay, challenges. We spoke of challenges earlier, and there's certainly a lot packed into this issue regarding the potential challenges, the range of challenges to grid modernization. Certainly we can all agree that the power industry is in a period of transition, perhaps a lot faster than we would have expected, say, just 5 or 10 years ago. And often these challenges are outside of the control of the utilities or the planners. Climate change, we talked about renewable portfolio standards, legislative mandates, state and federal level, all create greater uncertainty and the need for greater flexibility and responsiveness to these changes. So, one thing that is certainly critical to the process, though, is that the planning and budgeting process needs to be not only more robust, but flexible in terms of being responsive to a greater number of scenarios, increased number of options that need to be considered, as well as increased granularity in evaluating scenarios and options. And last but not least, tools that enable planners to consider a wide range of scenarios and options need to be conducted on a consistent, equitable basis. And this is essential to meet management expectations as well as regulatory scrutiny. So, with regard to the challenges, I referred to a recent Public Utilities Fortnightly article that the CEO of EPRI, Shad Mansour, mentioned as with regard to the Conference of Parties, which was an international group of planners and basically utility planners as well as government representatives that met in Glasgow in November 21 that talked about climate change, decarbonization. And one of the key takeaways from the conference, which was attended by about 120 world leaders, is that the clean energy future, we are looking at accelerating some of the emission reduction goals from 2050 to 2030, which is really not that far off. So the idea that a 50% reduction in emissions, decarbonization, essentially is going to require perhaps 3 to 4 times as much wind and solar that we have in existence today by, say, by 2030. That brings us up 200 gigawatts worldwide, up to around 600 or 800 gigawatts of renewable technology. The implications are pretty significant, of course, with regard to grid modernization and the impact it's going to have in terms of having a reliable and capable system that is able to pick up that additional amount of capability in terms of new resources. So one good example that comes to mind, of course, is National Reliability Energy Laboratory conducted a study over the past several years on behalf of the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, where they're looking to go to 100% renewables by 2045 and possibly as early as 2035. And as part of that, the resource mix may have to increase from about 10,000 megawatts to about 20,000 megawatts to accomplish that goal. And along with that, because of the electrification initiatives involving electric vehicles, building electrification, demand may increase by 50% or more over the next 10 years. So this all has significant implications in terms of grid modernization, the stress that it's going to create on the system, and the investments that are going to be required to be able to reliably meet those kind of changes. Now, LADWV may be a little bit of an exception, but does underscore the significance of the grid modernization and the budgeting and planning processes that will be needed to be able to come up with an overall investment plan that reliably meets the needs of the utility over time. So with that, Adam, on your end, as far as some of the challenges that AES has encountered as you begin looking forward to some of the climate change initiatives and targets that your company has established?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm very fortunate. I work for a very diverse company where we've got generation, transmission, distribution, green generation, huge solar and wind. And so our goals haven't changed in that, the AES Corporation has always been focused on the decarbonization of our grid. What's changing now is the market is demanding this of us, right? So as utilities, the market is requiring us to be able to adapt. And so I think, the challenges from, a planning perspective, just from, core engineering, right? The ability to take renewables from various generators in various locations on our grid, and then be able to distribute it to our customers is very, very important. And the fact of the matter is that that is not in our control, but we must do it. Like, our mandate is to serve, is to deliver that power. And so, for us, you mentioned that not everything is in a utility's control, and that's absolutely true. But because that's a reality, that gives us a greater need to control well the things that we can control, right? Long-term investment planning, being able, you mentioned being able to consistently value projects, and I'm sure we're going to jump into that more later. But all of those things are things that we can control and that give us the ability to respond to those that we can't. We know that at AES, we split it up really in two different buckets, right? We think about CapEx as far as long-term planned capital. That's capital which is planned and budgeted in a year, at least a year prior to execution. And then we have short-term plan or partially planned capital, which is CapEx, which is identified and executed within a single year. Think customer-driven projects, increase in storms or unexpected storms, those kind of things where we don't have full control over the short-term planned CapEx. It is a part of our life. But in order to be able to execute that well, we have to have very tight control and very good visibility for the rest of our portfolio. Did I answer your question, Gene?
You certainly have. So I think that brings us to the next slide, Russ.
Okay, perfect.
Okay. We mentioned some of the challenges in terms of planning for grid modernization in the context of era of change and, and significant changes with regard to whether it be related to load growth, climate change initiatives, regulatory mandates, both at the federal and state level. But, it clearly underscores the need for planning, and planning from a successful standpoint means transitioning, inclusion of GM, grid modernization, and more integrated and closer interaction among different organizations within or departments within the utility. And we view this as being essential as the greater number of scenarios and options that planners must consider in the budgeting process really demands closer cooperation, coordination among the various organizations within a utility. So, and that leads to greater consistency in terms of how planning is done, options are analyzed, more consistent assumptions, approaches, value optimization, quantification of risk, which is also essential to be able to pass internal review as well as external regulatory review and approval. And it's clear that regulators have raised the bar in terms of the rigor that utilities must apply in terms of justifying proposed investments. And along those lines now, Adam, for example, has AES seen a similar need to enhance coordination and planning among the different parts of the organization?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, with the influx in investment that we've seen over the last few years in AES, specifically in our utility businesses, we are, because we're required to be good stewards of our capital, right? For obvious reasons, we need to serve our customers well. And the way we do that is through that coordination. So when we think about the changes that come with smart grid, right? So in utilities, typically the smart grid initiatives are led by a separate PMO from the operations teams, right? And so you have this large tranche of investment that there's certainly a large degree of overlap with, an operating utility. And so additional coordination is required from a planning perspective. as far as being able to know, what work is being done where and when is it going to be executed, and then also from a cash flow perspective, being able to see clearly where all of the money is going, when and why is very, very important.
Okay. Okay, thank you for that. So with that, Russ, I think we can move on to the
Sure.
next slide.
I'm just going to ask actually on the system data, maybe commenting a little bit on that, as we move towards, doing more and more advancements around our planning and to drive really data-driven decisions. How, from both your perspectives, how critical obviously is the system data, and how are you helping, or how are you doing in AES, but how are you helping your clients, Gene, to get the data they need to make those decisions that drive better planning decisions?
Cool. I'll go first if that's okay on this one, Gene.
Sure. Yeah, by all means.
Sorry, this is a big one. This one is super important. Yeah. And so we have to have, in order to be responsive, in order to be agile and to respond to the ever-changing needs of the industry in general, and then add on top of that smart grid, fault location, all of the fun things that we're doing from an ADMS perspective. If you add all of that, then the need to coordinate and centralize data becomes even more important, because more people need to see where things are. Our stakeholder group, from a capital execution perspective, has grown exponentially to include people from all over the businesses. Whereas before, we may have had the luxury of operating within somewhat of a silo, right? And now, that no longer exists. And so having all of our projects in a common location that everyone can see with common analytics and metrics is very, very important, because we just don't have time to constantly share, and we don't want to have a bunch of meetings. So it's super important that everyone has access to a single source of truth for capital investment in real time. We all need to see it.
And I would add to that, certainly what we're seeing from a planning standpoint, in an era where we're seeing more non-traditional resources, distributed resources, demand response programs, increased automation, is need for greater level of granularity and rigor in the analysis, forecasting, say at the substation, at the circuit level, so we can accurately predict the impact that these non-traditional resources have. Certainly resources which have variable output, such as solar and wind. It's really critical to be able to accurately model those. And when we begin to look at these investments which are needed to be able to support these technologies, having the right analytical tools in place, both in terms of conducting simulation analyses that come up with accurate and predictable results, and then for analyzing and comparing dissimilar investments, replacing a transformer versus operational technologies needed to be able to support DER integration, system upgrades to be able to not only address growth, but also DER integration. Increased transparency of that process is becoming more and more critical. So we see both a need for more rigorous tools, more granular analysis, because of the more localized nature of these resources. We're dealing perhaps less with more of the centralized generation and resources which appear at the distribution level, both behind the meter as well as on the directly on the circuit. So all these challenges have really underscored the need for more detailed and rigorous planning tools, as well as methods for improving the budgeting process in terms of having consistent evaluation approaches, particularly between dissimilar investments. I suspect that's something that your organization is encountering as well, Adam.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we need to be able to consistently view the benefit from both a financial perspective, but more importantly, we have to be able to, clearly quantify the value of a project in terms of its benefit to society, its benefit to safety. How does this improve our reliability? So there are these kind of non-tangible drivers that help us make investment decisions. And it's very, very important that we remove the subjectivity from that process, right? That we think about our projects the same. And then, once we have that consistent valuation methodology, when we start talking about optimizing budgets and building that perfect portfolio for our specific business needs, we also have to have the ability to exclude things from optimization. So I talked about short-term plan CapEx, or things that we must do from a regulatory perspective. those are things that when we start optimizing and moving money around, we have to have the ability also to exclude them, to make those, must-do projects.
Okay.
And so having a single location where everything's together makes all those decisions possible, right?
I guess the perfect transition to the next slide.
It is.
Okay, let me do that. Here we go.
So a bit of a busy slide here, but I want to present this because we just talked about the increased level of rigor that's required to support investment decisions, and also to sort of break down the barriers organizationally within the utility, and also to be able to address a wide range of potential strategies, whether they be related to net zero energy carbon goals, policy initiatives, new programs, complying or developing new rate structures, especially in an environment where you have non-traditional resources, dealing with operational efficiency, but certainly a level of granularity at the forecasting level, one that reflects greater variability with regard to climate change, which could also mean increased growth levels as we begin to see warming temperatures that may result in increased demand on the system through additional, for example, air conditioning load. So a very integrated load forecasting process is needed not only for loads, but also for other technologies, electric vehicles, building electrification, as well as distributed resources, solar adoption. So the forecasting process has certainly become more complex. The detail or the rigor of system data that's needed to be able to drive or support those processes, and the level of rigor obviously has ramped up to be able to come up with predictable and accurate results. Looking at a greater number of pathways and options in terms of scenarios we might be looking at. So then you get into the deep dive planning process and the systems and tools that are needed, and the processes, if you will, to be able to support investment decisions that cover the full spectrum of impacts across the distribution, transmission, and the power resource levels is certainly an important part of that overall process. And the level of rigor and the tools that are needed is crucial, and the information that goes into it and assumptions is essential as well in terms of coming up with accurate results and defendable results. So I'd like to transition to the next slide and focus on the investment and planning optimization process, which is really the key step in this process. So I'm looking at all these steps along the way in terms of what we often refer to as integrated planning and capital investment process. And so it really underscores a range of processes and analyses and integration activities, including scenario analysis, that lead to accurate and detailed investment planning and optimization investments using the integrated data from that we see at the distribution, transmission, at the production level, looking at scenario analysis, value frameworks, and benefit cost analyses, the impact of their various pricing models. So this all underscores the need for very rigorous budgeting process and tools which are needed to be able to come up with a quote unquote an optimal plan, recognizing the great degree of variability with regard to potential scenarios and pathways in an era where projections for things such as demand as well as different levels of non-traditional sources such as DER is going to play. So there's a good deal of variability in that. So to coming up with an overall optimized plan really is essential in terms of having the right tools and processes in place to be able to accomplish that. So now, and given that, now, for example, Adam, at AES, and in the context of looking at competing demands for capital, traditional versus non-traditional investments, how AES has incorporated investment planning into the budgeting process in terms of optimizing your overall spending plan.
Yeah, absolutely. So I love this slide. Integrated planning at the AES utilities businesses, that's the exact term that we use to describe, the confluence of transmission, distribution, of load growth modeling, kind of top-down corporate forecasting, and then premise-up forecasting as well. And so, essentially what we're doing is and I look at this, all of this additional data, all of the new information that we have at our fingertips that we haven't had before. This is not something that happened to us. This is something that we want. And so there's an enormous amount of new capability that we have by being able to better trend and better forecast and optimize. But we know that, and anyone on this call who's looked at EV growth forecasts for their specific area, anyone who's seen those knows that there's a tremendous amount of variability in potential future outcomes in EV adoption rates, right? And so with that, we have to be able to do multiple scenario analysis and say, if scenario A happens, this is our optimal investment strategy for this specific scenario, or if scenario B happens. And the ability to optimize and have all of our projects aligned through a common value framework and to see everything in a single location gives us the ability to do that, right? It gives us the ability to say, okay, if outcome A happens, what is that optimal investment strategy? What is our plan? What do we do? What do we not do, and why? And having all that information in one location and consistently valued makes those discussions much, much more productive, because it removes the subjectivity from any of the analysis, right? It becomes an objective view of what do we need, what risks are our business facing, and how do we mitigate those risks, right? And so given any specific scenario, there might be broad differences in the risk outcomes, right? So having everything together gives us the ability to even optimize and see, right? And then the other piece, like from a customer perspective, also having a common value framework, it ensures that the customer's voice is heard in our investment decisions, because we've already quantified the value of customer benefit, right? Whereas it's not purely a financial discussion. So it's also very important.
Okay, I think that's a good transition into the next slide. Okay, yes, Russ, you just spoke regarding a value framework. So, certainly the prior slide focused on the integrated planning processes that basically confirms the need for what I would call a decision-based approach and one that incorporates value across a broad spectrum of scenarios and range of associated costs and benefits. So, for example, non-traditional investment options, regulatory mandates, greater role of third parties and customers, have become increasingly involved in the planning processes, and now raises the bar in terms of how investment options are evaluated, giving the range of potential outcomes that you had referred to earlier. So it really underscores the need to having a value framework that accurately captures value components for reliability, customer satisfaction, environmental impacts, regulatory risk, other forms of risk, while bringing in traditional factors such as asset age and condition, safety. We talked about increased uncertainty in forecasts, both for loads as well as distributed resources, and all taken together, this value framework is part of the prioritization of investment options. So when you think of the framework in terms of grid modernization, it needs to consider these non-traditional options and drivers such as those that we talked about earlier into a value-based decision-making process. And these could include addressing increased demand uncertainty, electric vehicles, other forms of electrification. We talked about climate change, which could lead to higher load due to increased temperature. So all these factors taken together really underscore the need for a value-based decision methodology of the tools to be able to accurately predict those values, especially across dissimilar investments. So Adam, perhaps you could speak to AES's approach in terms of adopting the value approach for prioritizing grid modernization investments versus, say, other types of investments as well.
Sure. Yeah, I'll speak kind of holistically, and then I'm going to go ahead and answer a question in the chat because this is such a good question. We'll answer it as we go. But for us, when we think about how we value projects, really what it is there's a financial component. There is what is the specific ROE, what are the O&M benefits for a specific project. That's fairly straightforward. That's been around forever in the utility industry. The things that we do when we talk about the value framework is really we're quantifying the risk of not completing a project, right? And when we think about risk, it's in ISO 55,000 terms. It's the probability of an issue or a failure happening if we don't make an investment, and then the impact of said investment, right? And the way that we know when we've optimized. So the way that we know for sure when we have optimized our portfolio and we're ready to go is whenever the outcomes of our capital investment portfolio are aligned with the outcomes of the business. So, you know, if we have specific metrics or targets around KD, safety, you know, et cetera, you know, does this optimization, does this CapEx portfolio drive us in the direction that we need to go to meet our targets? And that's how we know. And then the interesting part of that is that, you know, we may have to optimize multiple times throughout the year. You know, things change, things happen, incidents happen, and you know, having that consistent value framework gives you the ability to then go and rethink decisions that you made 6 months ago in light of new circumstances. And so initial optimization, we consider that complete whenever we are aligned with the specific needs or risk tolerance of the business, right? And then re-optimization, it's just how well can we respond to things that happen to us, those things that are out of our control that Gene mentioned. So whoever wrote that question, that's an awesome question. I love it.
Yeah, I agree. I think, you know, part of the strength of the framework is exactly that ability, as Adam is saying, to link, you know, your measures of the output from your analysis of your investments with those strategic goals of the organizations and what you're really driving your business towards. So I think that is one of the great points. So yeah, thank you, Adam, and thank you for the question, because it really highlighted a super important point. Gene, back over to you.
Okay. So we can move on to, okay, so we had talked about the value-based decision methodology. And so we think of that in context of, we have traditional investments and non-traditional investments. And I think we can move on to the next slide. Here we go. Thank you.
Yep, come on. Yep.
So, and in the not too distant past, typically grid modernization often meant renewal, replacing poles, wires, transformers, capacity-related decisions for new stations and circuits, upgrading the transmission network, moving towards AMI, enhanced SCADA, OMS, T&D reinforcement, storm hardening, protective relaying, fleet and general plant. Now grid modernization has incorporated a much broader range of potential investments and impacts as well. We've talked about distributed energy resources, whether it be solar, demand response programs, energy storage, electric vehicles, and the need for enabling technologies, operational technologies such as distributed energy resource management systems, advanced distribution management systems, to be able to manage and then cope with two-way power flows and a much more complex distribution network, one that involves or requires advanced communication systems. Looking at non-wireless alternatives certainly has been a primary issue in many jurisdictions, which have adopted NWA as an alternative to these traditional investments. We talked about the EV infrastructure, active inverter control, such that the utilities may be able to rely to some degree on the inverter control capability to manage voltage, reactive VARs as well. So we're in an era where we have a whole series of non-traditional investment options, impacts that have to be addressed. So we've certainly moved away from poles and wires to something much more expansive in terms of what grid modernization means, that have to be considered in the planning, evaluation, and budgeting process. FERC has gotten involved with Order 2222, kind of raised the bar, if you will, with regarding system operators and regional operators such as Cal ISO, PJM, ISO New England, to allow third-party aggregation of distributed resources to participate in wholesale markets. And clearly this is going to lead to additional grid modernization issues in terms of managing these resources that may be participating in the wholesale market. So the enabling technologies that we talked about, such as ADMS and DERMS, along with secure communication systems, are certainly going to be needed to visualize, manage these non-traditional resources, as well as automation, since system operators are not going to be able to manage these processes manually. So they certainly don't want to be overwhelmed. So we really are in an era where grid modernization initiatives and enabling technologies are going to play a key role in terms of being able to move forward in terms of where we have been in the past to one where we have a much varied mix of sources that support the grid, not only at the generation level, but now at the T&D level as well. So perhaps, and in the context of grid modernization and the need for being able to compare really quite dissimilar options on a consistent basis, the need for value-based tools framework to be able to compare on a comparable basis these dissimilar investments is really critical at this stage. And both Russ and you, Adam, have talked about the systems which you may have applied or have available to be able to compare these type of investments. Perhaps, Adam, you could talk a little bit about comparing some of the traditional options to some of the more advanced technology that we're now beginning to see in terms of investment evaluation and decision making.
Yeah, and so I think one comment I'll make before I answer the question is in my view, or the way that I view traditional and non-traditional investments, is there's really no such thing. In that I think that our current state right now is requiring a merger of these traditional and non-traditional investments, and it's up to us to get with the program, right? So these non-traditional investments are here, they're coming, our customers demand them, our large C&I customers, and a few good examples from an AES perspective, to put a little AES spin on it. We're big players in the energy storage industry, lithium-ion batteries, and so obviously we have a strong interest in promoting the growth of energy storage, specifically looking for alternatives to transmission investment or even distribution investment, at a smaller scale. But we have to be able to value those benefits of each different technology type or each potential solution, and then be able to understand, how those apply to the larger strategy of the company, right? And so it's up to us, not only because our customers are requiring it, because it's the right thing to do, to push and advance technologies that are most beneficial to our customers, right? And so if I can install, energy storage of some sort, and it can forego a larger investment, right? Obviously, that's the right thing to do. And so the value frameworks and the specific value models or alternative analysis gives us the ability to have, a single project, stack different alternatives to meet a desired outcome, and then make the best decision, right? And it's the best decision for us, for our customers, or to meet our specific, regulatory mandates or constructs.
Okay.
Just wondering on the regulatory side. So as you're starting to put together these plans with non-traditional initiatives, how are the regulators receiving this? Is it a fair amount of work to convince them of that approach, or like how are you approaching the regulators now that you're coming to them with a plan that obviously is very different than what they've seen traditionally?
I would say that, and this is not just regulators, this applies to executives and
Sure.
engineers and managers and asset management directors. We all respond to good data. So no one in this business, no one is in the business of saying no to good ideas or things that are actually going to be beneficial. The challenge is how do you communicate benefit, right? How do you communicate value? And so the value framework that we use gives us those tools, right? And so when we have something that maybe looks crazy, I always say, if your boss doesn't think you're crazy at least a couple times a year, you're probably not pushing too hard, right? And whenever we have ideas that 5 or 10 years ago might have been seen as unorthodox or crazy, the way that we push those through is by being able to clearly articulate value, right? And not just financial value. Like I said, it's customer value. It's quantifying, less tangible benefits. And once you have that down, it becomes very hard to say no to good ideas. But communication, quantifying and communicating, that's the challenging part.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we can move to the last slide and summarize our discussion today. And we talked about the complexity of grid planning in an era of significant change, greater variability, climate change, decarbonization goals. So we're clearly in a period of rapid change and transformation driven by these legislative, regulatory directives, mandates, and as I mentioned, greater uncertainty. So grid modernization, in our view, certainly will play a key role in meeting the challenges, balancing traditional modernization investments to meet growth, deterioration, obsolescence, as well as to accommodate new technologies such as distributed resources, electric vehicles, and other electrification initiatives. But underscoring all this, of course, the need for a value-based framework that we talked about, as a key component in terms of being able to thoroughly and accurately assess and evaluate competing projects and investments, assessing risk, to be able to come up with the most cost-effective plan. Again, balancing traditional investments versus non-traditional investments, having rigorous tools in place that Russ and Adam have both discussed. And these are essential given the vast number of investment choices and potential values that are part of the value framework. So in closing, I would add that flexibility of investment choices, greater transparency, rigorous tools, accurate data, quality assurance, integrated processes, breaking down barriers are all key ingredients to a successful outcome for grid modernization. So with that, Adam or Russ, anything you might want to add in closing?
So, I mean, for me in closing, the key point is a value-based decision-making framework is essential. And when we value things, what we're doing is we're quantifying risk, the risk of inaction, a risk of doing nothing. What happens if we do not do these? What happens if we experience those failures? And, being consistent and having that transparency makes a world of difference in our ability to meet the evolving needs of the market, and then also the demands of our customers and regulators as well.
Okay, well, thank you both. We've had a bunch of questions, so my thought now, let's jump into some of these questions. Adam, maybe you want to touch on the one that just came through on the chat on regulators, because I think it kind of expands on what my question was to you earlier about how are North American regulators for quantification of environmental public safety risk and pretty much any other social kind of risk metrics that you're now putting into your value framework and using those to evaluate projects.
So I can't speak for all North American regulators, and I can't. But what I can say is it's really the same thing that I said before. Is we have to be able to quantify and articulate the reasons why we're making decisions. And so quantifying value and setting a budget, are they setting a financial value? Absolutely they are. We have to think about, we're a business, and so we have to be able to quantify. I always say quantify the intangibles. So what is the impact of a safety event? What is the financial impact of an environmental event? And the way that you calculate that is by understanding the costs to actually remediate the event, to clean up the spill, to deal with the actual event. And then also you have to add a value to all of the other things that happen, the negative publicity, right? The public relations work that has to be done and all the things that can affect you in the future. And so I don't know. I don't know if all North American regulators are ready for this, but I think just as a matter of principle, we have to be able to justify our decisions.
Yeah.
And this is how we do it, right?
I think one of the messages that came through very loud and clear was the amount of change required as organizations transition to this new process. So given the future of the grid, and can you maybe both you, Adam, from your side and your business, but also Gene from those clients you've worked with, comment on the organizational change and the whole change management and what's been required to date, and what do you see in the future to navigate this challenge?
Yeah, I'll jump in here with, so basically what we have seen is, first of all, the organizations have changed as a result of the technology. As an example, as we begin to think about greater integration of renewable resources as well as electric vehicles. So we've seen organizations change with regard to how they evaluate these technologies. So organizations have expanded in terms of their skill sets and capabilities to be able to evaluate and analyze these options and the impact they're going to have on the system. Certainly has increased the skills level requirement as we begin to think about more advanced systems, automation. So, what we have seen is a greater focus in terms of the skill level required to be able to assess, analyze, and maintain what has become increasingly complex systems.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, absolutely, Gene. I mean, I think you nailed it, my friend. For us, change management, everything is changing anyway. So we have to know how to manage. We have to know how to repurpose. And we talked about technology and the things that it brings with change management from a smart grid perspective. If you think about AMI, what do smart meters do for us from a change management? Well, I mean, it completely reshapes part of our workforce that's boots on the ground every day interacting with customers, right? And so change management and being able to retrain, repurpose people is very, very important. It has to be interwoven with everything that we're doing.
And then one of the challenges as well is when we begin to think about comparability in terms of traditional resources, traditional T&D plans compared, and looking at those, on a quid pro quo basis with non-traditional investments, being able to properly analyze what is needed to be able to reliably and safely meet the system demands, if you will. So if you're comparing a transmission station or feeder upgrade, how do you ensure that these new sources, new participants in the market, the prosumer aspect of customers playing a greater role in terms of serving the energy needs, being able to analyze those options accurately and ensure that they are going to be reliable and available when needed, it really has raised the bar in terms of the level of complexity and the tools and assumptions that are needed to be able to say, yes, this is a viable alternative. It provides a certain degree of value, and we're willing to move forward and make that investment. And that's been a pretty high hurdle to meet because to think about, for example, on an NWA basis, looking at non-traditional resources in lieu of traditional investments, it's clear that they need to be dealt with on a comparable basis. We're looking at additional value drivers, perhaps not just capacity, but can these resources be able to provide system support in terms of offsetting energy as well as providing demand? So we're looking at a whole series of potential value drivers, while at the same time ensuring that they provide the degree of availability and reliability that's needed to be able to support the grid on a reliable basis.
Yeah,
so it's been a real challenge.
Yeah, one thing to add to that, to answer question 8, which is also a fantastic question around SIME. And so the point that you make is our ability to respond to changing needs, to the prosumers, to our C&I customers that have different demands. So all of the engineering and modeling that has to happen on the front end of the investment optimization process, for us, it happens in SIME. We mentioned Opus One as well. I see SIME and Opus One as the primary inputs to alternatives analysis that we use in Copperleaf, where, if we look for a specific project, the project is really to solve a problem, right? What is the problem that we're trying to solve? And then the alternatives coming out of SIME or Opus One, SIME's for us, coming out of SIME are, what are the different ways that we can solve this problem? How can we, from a technical perspective, meet the need? And the alternatives analysis, by valuing each of those alternatives, it helps us to choose the most favorable one. And so what it does is it takes the thought process that a distribution planner or transmission planner is already going through, thinking through them, and it quantifies the value of each alternative, but it allows you to stack them in a portfolio of projects that also have multiple alternatives. And the optimization then helps you choose, what is the best outcome, which alternative is best given the constraints that you've placed on the optimization, right? So I think that's super important. So I see those engineering tools as inputs to alternatives in Copperleaf.
Yeah. Just notice we've had some questions around federal support and funding. Do you see the potential? Is there any sources you're currently pursuing as far as that really are well aligned with grid modernization and helping fund some of these distribution system upgrades or some of the types of projects we've been talking about today?
Well, one thing that certainly comes to mind is the infrastructure bill that was passed by Congress. Billions of dollars are set aside looking at grid modernization, electric vehicle support, transportation electrification, cybersecurity enhancements. So it looks like billions of dollars will be available, through some mechanism, which I'm not quite clear on at this stage, but certainly that's going to be a source of potential support for grid modernization, and that's likely to be sorted out on a forward-looking basis. But so certainly funds will be available from that for all intents and purposes to be able to support a wide range of grid modernization investments, across a wide range of technologies. So I think that's going to be an important source of funding, in terms of from a grid modernization perspective.
Yeah.
Yep, I don't have anything to add there.
Yeah.
No.
Another question on maybe Adam for you, over to you, is what are the processes you use within AES to like proactively engage during the planning process when you're putting together these capital plans with community groups, municipalities, just talking about all those stakeholders and some DER developers, like how do you go out and engage with them proactively to get their feedback and to input into your overall plan?
Yeah, I mean, we have an entire team of people at AES who are directly engaged in the communities where we serve and live. And so, each of those, we call them kind of community ambassadors, right? They are our eyes and ears for a specific township or area. And they're the ones that serve as that primary interface point between our stakeholders. They're the ones that are bringing to us things that we should think about. What are we hearing? What is the feeling that we're getting? And then even from, a CEO level, where we have executives that are constantly engaging with city councils and, in Indianapolis, it's bringing the feedback that they're getting and incorporating it. So there's a bunch of different ways, I think. And I also think that's another piece, the stakeholder piece, that has to be 100% intimately, inextricably linked to our investment plan, is how are we actually affecting our stakeholders? And we have to talk to them. We have to talk to our customers. We've got to be part of the communities where we live and serve, right? So.
Yeah, that's excellent. And maybe kind of on a similar thread as far as stakeholders, there's another question around how do you see the value-based framework being influenced by resource adequacy mandates on deliverable, dispatchable capacity, things like that. So how do you manage that?
Yeah, I mean, so I talked earlier about being able to force optimization, right? And so where we have specific mandates, where we have projects that are must do that we have to do because of a regulatory, from either IURC or PUCO or from a local requirement that we may have. We have the ability to say these are must do because of those, whatever the mandate may be. We must do these projects, and so we just exclude them from optimization and we move them to the top of the list because we have to do them, right? And where you have a regulatory mandate to complete something, it doesn't really make sense to include those in your optimization anyway, because you're going to do it no matter what. So all it does is it reduces the pool that you have to optimize from.
Yeah. And one of the challenges along the way, and when we begin thinking about the investment options, always considering that deteriorated assets. So even though one might think, or the regulators may be pushing for certain solutions, there's still a fundamental need for must-do replacements. Aging cable is a good example of that, replacement of poles. So there's always this continual balance of trade-offs in terms of expanding the system to be able to meet some of these legislative or regulatory goals or initiatives, but at the same time, you still have the basic power system infrastructure in place, and much of it is aging for many utilities. So, looking at the must-do aspect of it, we always find that you have to keep in mind, substantial amount of investments could be required for effectively replacement of assets. The big question, of course, is what is the role of these non-traditional investments while at the same time balancing the needs of an aging infrastructure? So that's been one of the key challenges that's been introduced into the planning and budgeting process.
And just looking at the time, I think one final question. So kind of to both of you. So Adam, when you're looking at your plans and looking out, what type of grid modernization projects do you consider to be short-term? Which are the ones that you need to do right away? And which of those that you see are a little bit further out? And maybe, Gene, you can comment from your experience working with other clients as well.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think any of it's further out. So I think the fact of the matter is that all of it is right now. If I had to prioritize a range of importance, I would say instrumentation, things that bring visibility to existing assets on the grid. That would be my number one priority. Then as soon as we have instrumentation, it's ADMS, right? It's preparing for the coming FERC 2222 changes. And I don't see a path forward with FERC 2222 without a robust ADMS system.
So, and one thing I would add to that we mentioned earlier is the resources, planners, designers, construction firms, we've been hearing more and more that resource availability, having the staff in place to plan, design, go through the permitting process, as well as internal crews, external crews, is going to be a real challenge, especially with regard to the amount of investment and upgrades that are needed. So, you know, we're in an era now where having enough resources now becoming a real significant factor on a forward-looking basis.
Well, it looks like we're at time, so I want to thank you both very much, Adam and Gene, for an excellent discussion. I hope everyone in the audience has enjoyed, and thank you all for your great questions. And I will pass it back to PJ.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you all. Fantastic presentation. For our audience, we hope you've also enjoyed today's presentation. As you log off, please take a moment to complete our survey and give us your feedback so we can continue to provide you with quality content. Thank you for attending. This does conclude today's presentation.